Welcome to All About Money. I am Chloe Feng. Most of the world has moved on and is living with COVID, but China is insisting on sticking to its zero COVID strategy. Tens of thousands of testing booths have been set up across China with expensive equipment installed to stamp out the virus in every corner of the country. Beijing has reportedly spent 300 billion yuan on PCR tests alone since the pandemic began. Some argue that the massive bill is worth it, but others are worried about the extra burden on cash-strapped local governments. Joining me to discuss Beijing's public health strategy is Wang Dan, chief economist of Hang Seng Bank, China. Great to have you back, Dan.
My pleasure, Chloe.
And first, I know that you're now in Shanghai in the financial hub, and the city has just emerged from the 2-month-long lockdown. So tell us, how has your life been going after the lifting of the citywide lockdown?
Well, everybody has a different length in lockdown. For myself, I was in the lockdown situation for more than 70 days. So, of course, I was quite happy when the lockdown measures was lifted. But life after that was not drastically different. Although many companies are preparing for many of their employees to go back, any new COVID cases will lock a lot of people back to their compounds, or the whole region can have a partial lockdown of some sort. So most of the shops are still not open. If you go out to see restaurants and coffee shops, you are more likely to see them either partially closed or only can order takeouts. So overall, I think the city is trying to get back to normal, but now we're in this transition period where everybody is trying to contain the COVID, but the restrictive measures are not completely lifted yet. Now everyone is trying to get a 72-hour of COVID test before going into any public places. So these measures are also being strictly carried out, and more places are catching up with setting up enough booths or trying to relocate the testing booth in different parts of the city to cater to people's needs of catching the new COVID cases.
As you just mentioned, now you have to present a 72-hour PCR test result in order to enter the public venues. And what do you think about the current availability of the testing booths? Is it very convenient for you to get tested as you wish?
Well, the distribution of the testing booth is quite uneven. For the area I'm living in, it's very close to the French Quarter. The population density is quite high. So you see this kind of 1 to 2 kilometers length of the queue always in front of almost every single PCR test booth. But if you bike down for like 20 minutes or 30 minutes to any direction to the north or to the south, then most of those booths are empty. So now my strategy is just to get on a shared bike and bike as far as possible. But getting the tests in time is still a challenge. Although it's 72-hour requirement, it's actually 42-hour because it usually take about 12 hours before you can get a PCR test result. Then everybody now is basically doing the PCR test every other day.
Wow, then the city will conduct roughly 15 times of the PCR test, citywide PCR tests every month. How would it affect the city's GDP growth at some level?
Well, if we're comparing the cost in doing the PCR test to the city's GDP, it's quite negligible, especially for a large city like Shanghai. The PCR test, even at the current level, is only less than 1% of Shanghai's fiscal revenue and less than 0.1% of the GDP. So if we're talking about its impact on GDP growth, we don't need to worry about it. What's more worrying, though, is the crowding out effect for other medical resources. Because if we're comparing to the spending in the PCR test versus spending in other medical assistance, then it's quite substantial. And now it looks like we're going to make the PCR test long term as part of the normal life in every single city in China. And that's quite a substantial fiscal cost for especially the local governments in central and western China.
Right, got it. And as you also just mentioned, Shanghai is a relatively wealthy, region in China, but then the regional development are quite imbalanced in the country. While Shanghai may be capable of handling the situation or the policy as such, maybe some other regions or provinces, they cannot sustain such policies. For example, in Henan, we know that the population of 99 million is estimated that the monthly cost of regular PCR test is about 5.2 billion yuan, and the annual cost would be about 62.6 billion yuan. And in 2021, Henan's total government revenue was 661.1 billion yuan. Based on this calculation, the PCR testing would account for nearly 10% of the government annual revenue in this region. And if China continues this policy and like it does right now, it covers the PCR test fee, how long do you think this policy can last? Like in the national level, do you have any calculation about this?
Well, I can only speculate based on the central government policy signals because it still looks like the zero COVID strategy would dominate all economic policies. So this is the number one priority ever since 2020, and there is no sign of changing the course. So that means the zero COVID strategy will last as long as it's needed. And before we see any effective treatment drug or very effective vaccination coming out, then we will have to do the similar kind of PCR test. And for many of the mid-sized Chinese cities, this has become a very high fiscal burden. For the case that you mentioned in Henan, for cities like Zhengzhou and Luoyang, it is actually more than 10% of the local GDP have been spent on PCR tests because it's not just the test itself, it's also setting up the booth, having the personnel to work in those booths. And these are all the money coming from the fiscal revenue. It will be a big challenge to figure out how to make this fiscally sustainable. I don't think China has figured out a way yet to make this cheap enough for people to do. There's also the time cost, let's not forget. And for every individual, this has become one of the permanent costs, which can hinder the business development and the travel between regions.
Right, and we also seen some very expensive, like auto machine that is being used for, assisting the swapping process. Like in Henan, we saw some equipment like the testing booth with some robots assistant that is costing about 40,000 yuan. So it's quite expensive as well. And as you just mentioned about the personnel issues, and now we have some figures. According to the estimates by the Social Security's estimation, a year's mass testing for the roughly 500 million residents of China's first and second tier cities could top 1.7 trillion yuan, about 1.5% of China's 2021 GDP, or about 8.7% of last year's public fiscal revenue. Do you agree with this estimation? What is your thoughts on this?
Whatever the estimation methods people use, the results are largely consistent. It is a substantial portion of the fiscal revenue. It doesn't matter if it's 5% or 10%. On the city level, it is a very substantial burden. And let's not forget, there are other social issues also waiting to get more fiscal support. And even for medical expense, COVID control is only one part of the pandemic that we need to worry about. There are other pandemics already arising global-wise. Are we ready for the monkeypox or other type of pandemic that might come to China? Now the border is still closed, so the risk is low. But as time goes by, we can't say that all the resources can be just concentrated on COVID control. So I'm not sure how the public finance can sustain this without issuing more debt. So my suspect is that there would be more allocation in the local debt quota for the local government to issue that in the public market, trying to support this kind of effort.
Right, Dan. And also, I read a report saying that if China continues its policy, conducting, PCR tests every other day, according to the previous company's estimate, it says that maybe China can sustain for 3 years. How do you think about this estimation in terms of the duration? Are we really capable of sustaining this PCR test for 3 years from your knowledge about the China's annual reserve as well?
Well, this estimate is based on stock. So we can't forget that every year there's also an increase in the medical reserve to support the people's spending in healthcare. So over the years, there can be other measures as well from the central government and local government trying to replenish this pool. So I don't think we're just waiting here trying to deplete all the money in the pool. And within 3 years, it is highly unlikely that the COVID situation will be as severe as what we're facing now. There might be more variations, but there would also be better vaccines and better treatment drugs. And by then, I believe that the COVID control measures would have evolved by a lot. So now our measure is already very different from 2020. So if within 3 years, we're still doing the PCR test every other day, I would be very surprised.
Right. Thank you very much for your insights, Dan. Let's take a short break. Coming up next, we'll have more discussions on Shanghai's economic recovery, as well as the sustainability of China's public finance. Do stay tuned.